centenary of Bram Stoker's death, all of us have gathered to pay our respects to Stoker and show our gratitude and appreciation of this always interesting and innovative writer. We've all been inspired by him in various ways, and by his work, of course, and his legacy has had a worldwide influence.
I'm Holly. I work here at Keats House, and we're very excited to be hosting this symposium over the next 2 days.
We're here to celebrate Bram Stoker, the father of literary vampirism, creator of Dracula, the undead, the king of vampires. Dracula, then, is the most filmed literary character ever, even topping Sherlock Holmes. For as Van Helsing says, he is known everywhere that man has been. He lives on and cannot die.
We want to share with you today a remarkable discovery. A journal that Bram Stoker kept while he was still living in Dublin in the 1870s, long before Dracula. The original journal comprises about 160 pages with 310 individual entries. He did not adopt a shorter form Bram until several years later, after the death of his father. Now, as for the nature of entries in the journal deals with subjects ranging from riddles to travel, from court cases to christenings. Dacre and I made a pilgrimage to gravestones. Now, most Dracula enthusiasts or Stoker enthusiasts have never heard of gravestones. But we discovered from the journal that this is where it all began. Above all, the journal gives us a few glimpses of the man best known as the author of Dracula. His social life, his sensitivity, his character, his moral values, his Gothic sensibility, and, last but not least, his magnificent Irish sense of humour. During the journal, Bram makes frequent memos to himself. For example, at one point he says, "Mem, story, go to sleep under rug of catskins." Don't think he ever wrote that story. It would have been an interesting one.
I'm an indirect relation. My great-grandfather was Bram's youngest brother. Look at Bram, and my interest is in more of a behavioral science. What made this man tick? And by looking at his entries in the journal, why he chose things is very important. But you also have to frame it and say what's going on in his life. The more I delve into this, the more I'm convinced he lived the Stoker family motto that was on the crest when we started digging a couple of years ago: what is true and honorable.
Anyone that's ever been a university student has had to stay in boarding houses will, I think, relate to this story, even if you haven't. Horan and 3 other men once had lodgings in Gardner Street Lower. They had taken them by the quarter, but after a few weeks found that their landlady was plundering them fearfully. To test this, they opened a bottle of sherry and placed it in a cupboard, and no one touched it. Still, it got less and less and less until it was finished. Whole joints disappeared, etc. They then said they would not stay any longer and got other lodgings. The landlady told them she would not let them go and would, if necessary, prosecute for the rent. They said very well, and they stayed. They always breakfasted, dined out, so that there was no plunder. They came home very late, and one by one, each one knocked up the house. They gave bachelor parties lasting till 4 and 5 o'clock with dances. They gave musical parties with horns and a drum, and got friends to call, always some of them, when going home from parties at the wee hours of the morning. At the end of the second week, the landlady implored them to go and offered to let them off the rent that was due.
He interviewed Winston Churchill in 1908, and it was not an easy interview to get. But one of the quotes from Churchill is, you're the man that wrote Dracula, I'll give you the interview. And they actually became friends.
With T. Martelli, Latchford, and myself went. There were thousands of people there, and all the brass bands in Dublin. Late in the evening, many men got drunk, and some sick. One man got sick in the center of the hall. The floor was waxed. You know what's coming. Immediately, a lot of fellows with one impulse rushed at the place and cut a slide. That's a great phrase, isn't it? Cut a slide. It was awful. He didn't say he was cutting the slide. There's always other people in there. You might see shortly after a man being brought over from the bar deliberately to get sick in the right place for the continuance of the pastime.
With a capacity to be reserved and sardonic in life, as well as deeply charismatic, on stage Irving transformed mid-Victorian melodrama's moral simplicities, its preoccupation with the outward workings of good and evil, into the inner consciousness of a fin de siècle disposition obsessed by human dualities. Irving portrayed tortured sinners, Matthias and the Bells, and saints, Becket. Stoker, with a disposition towards the Gothic evident from his early fiction, imbibed the Gothic climate of the Lyceum, and this helped to cultivate the figure of the vampire in Stoker's literary imagination.
Though Dracula remains the central focus of actual reading within Stoker's considerable output, modern criticism has tempered the approach to that work with an acknowledgement that the author was, even in the midst of a demanding professional life, an often diligent researcher who seldom left the circumstances of his plots to the vagaries of pure chance. Stoker's Count may indeed be a ruthless warrior hero, superficially cast in the mould of Wilkinson's historical, I quote, this is in capitals in Wilkinson's book, voyevode, in parentheses, Dracula, but is also replete with perceptible late Victorian anxieties rendered strikingly evident by his detailed physiognomy. As such, the Count retains a consistent function as an Eastern primitive degenerate foil to an idealised Saxon West which has, nonetheless, grown excessively confident in its secular technological prosperity. The tapering fingers of Haggard's Asher, and she's a few thousand years old as well, certainly anticipate those of Stoker's Queen Tira, who's definitely a few thousand years old. And even if the former's hand remains attached to its living owner, both ancient monarchs further tease their modern male admirers through diaphanous or absent clothing. Stoker's borrowing in the Duel of Seven Stars, a form of plagiarism, it may be regarded as, is, I think, really a debased form of scholarship, a dissemination through popular media of the precious property of others, in total regard to their current rights or historical wishes. In this sense, therefore, I think Stoker just remains a participant in that great popular culture which allows that kind of thing to happen even to this very day.
Similarly, many close examinations of Dracula and other vampire texts fail to consider TV adaptations of the text or the impact of television upon its development. This, director of An American Werewolf in London and the vampire film Innocent Blood, fondly remembers channel hopping between favourite Universal horror films as a child, leaping back and forth from film to film as each became too scary. While Jeremy Dyson, one of TV's League of Gentlemen, explains the impact of seeing his first horror image on television as a child. This image. As we played happily in the front room, an afternoon TV show was running a piece on Halloween and broadcast a clip from Murnau's film showing the Count rising from the hold of the ship he had taken to Bremen. We froze in front of the television screen, the image of the Count alone enough to transfix us in absolute terror. While clearly modelled on Bela Lugosi's Dracula, although with a few differences, in particular fangs and a monocle. The Count was initially surrounded by traditional Gothic tropes, including a haunted castle, cobwebs, bats, lightning that struck whenever he delivered his maniacal laugh, which usually came after counting 1, 2, 3, 3 vampire bats, Like Stoker's vampire, he bore no reflection, but unlike traditional vampires, there is no evidence that he ever drank blood. His Gothic appearance was, in fact, consciously toned down a few years later, less often presented in his castle, and his laugh was made less sinister, because there were concerns that he was too scary for children. The influence of television upon the perpetuation of interest in the vampire and the recognition of Dracula's iconic graphic image should not be underestimated.
Are some Dracula stories that do return quite explicitly in various ways to Stoker's version. Issue number 9, in which Dracula finds himself trapped for various reasons in a rather boring small town, albeit one with a mad vicar on the loose. It's a horror comic, but it's still a fairly boring town, where he encounters a thoroughly ordinary couple, Dave and Andrea, with whom he becomes involved. In this story, Dracula and Dave have a couple of heart-to-hearts about their respective situations. Dave is worried about being pinned down in the small town. He wants to leave, while Dracula worries about his lack of roots, the fact he's always on the move. When they part at the story's conclusion, one gets a sense that they have both learned from each other, and that in terms of their personal journeys, Dracula and Dave have both moved on just a little. In an ongoing format in which Dracula can shift from antagonist to protagonist from one month to the next and back again, such moments of quietness and reflection and a more multifaceted presentation of Dracula himself becomes possible.
One day what I thought I would do was I would go back in time and find the very oldest vampire stories I could, have a look at those stories, see what they were like, make a story up out of them. I thought I knew what a vampire was. This was my idea of a vampire, and of course we know that a vampire has certain characteristics. The bat, the transformation to the bat, the stake through the heart, the drinking of blood, the mirror, sunlight, and garlic, and many, many other things. However, in the original folklore, I did come across transformations. The vampire can turn into certain other animals. They can turn into horses, they can turn into cows, they can turn into pigs, cats, men, which is a bit weird, and scariest of all, they can turn into sheep. So this, I think, was a Greek name for the vampire that actually means drum-like, because it's presumably because they found this kind of stretched, bloated corpse in the grave, and you think, well, this is weird and wrong, and therefore it must be evil, and this person must be a vampire. And how do you get rid of a balloon? What's the simplest way? But pop it. And a stake would do that, but so would thorns, of course. And then that turns into other kind of things in the folklore, pricking the body with needles, putting holes in the feet or a hole in the belly. This idea of this is what a vampire is like, this is where it all kind of went wrong for me, as I read more and more of these tales and discovered how simply contradictory they all are, and the really random, wide assortment of features that define or don't define a vampire. Notion of the wedding of the dead, the death wedding, the nunta mortului, which is this thing, as you can see, it's a real ceremony that they genuinely do, even to this day. And this happens when a young person or anyone in the village dies unmarried, and they think it's a sad thing for someone to die unmarried, so they marry them at their funeral. So it's half funeral, half wedding. And interestingly, if it's, let me get this right, if it's a girl who dies, they don't actually get a surrogate groom, but if it's the other way around, if it's a man who's died, they will get a surrogate bride, and this bride will actually have to go through this process of marrying the dead man in his coffin. These are photographs of the other way around. So here, I think it's this girl's sister who's died. So she's in the coffin under here. Here the mourners in the coffin under a shroud. And here a little bridesmaid standing by her dead sister.
Where is this, sorry?
This is in Romania, in the Maramuresh. And these are photographs from Gail Kligman's book, The Wedding of the Dead. Fantastic book. Yeah. Really, really good. Yeah. Interesting, however, as I said, the other, they think it's sad that you should die unmarried, but they also think that you are more likely to become a vampire after death if you die unmarried. So that's a really significant reason, again, connection to the vampire lore, why they're doing it. And on that subject, again, how a vampire is created. Now, today we're pretty much left with the notion that a vampire bites a human and the human becomes a vampire if they don't die. That, I can't even remember if I came across that in the folklore, but there are a myriad of other ways in which vampires are created, and this would be one, dying unmarried, a suicide, murder victim, dying unbaptized. In the original folklore, not really mentioned. I mean, the way that a vampire gets its blood, the Russian vampire gets his blood with a pointed tongue, and he just sticks his tongue straight into your artery. There's some film actually where they use that, and then the tongue has bizarre little teeth at the end.
Del Toro's Blade, and in his book as well, he uses that.
That's right. So, and then as to what who the vampire actually is and what he does, at this point it all kind of fell apart. I won't read through this. I mean, you can read through it while I'm talking if you like, but it just gives a kind of idea of the complete weird random nonsense that I was reading about vampires. I'd set out to find, if you like, the prototypical vampire, and at this point I'm in disarray because I discover that it doesn't exist.